One of my favorite additions to Final Cut Pro 11 is the brand new reframe effects. However, if you ask me, there are some upgrades that could be made to take them to the next level. So in this video, using Apple Motion, we are going to add the ability to change the outline to a gradient. We're going to make it so you can disable the on-screen controls. We're going to do some basic UI cleanup, and we're also going to add in the option to change the speed. Plus, we're going to convert everything over into a title, which makes this effect way more useful. But let me say really quickly, this video is going to be much more on the technical side when it comes to Apple Motion. If you've never worked with Apple Motion before, maybe hold off on this one and check out my brand new Apple Motion's beginner's guide that I just dropped last week. Typically, I publish all my motion projects over into my Patreon page, but for this particular project, I'm making it completely free and available to everyone because these are tools that are already built into Final Cut Pro. And that also means that if you're on an older version of Final Cut Pro and you couldn't get Final Cut Pro 11, you should still have access to these tools. So if you're interested in picking that up, make sure you follow the links to my Patreon page down below. And with that being said, let's get into this tutorial. To get started with this tutorial, we're actually going to need to first open up Final Cut Pro. You can locate the effects over here inside of Effects under Reframe, and you'll see Callout. All you need to do is right-click on that callout and then select Open a Copy in Motion. What's great is that means this will copy the project file in Motion. That way, if we make any changes, we're not ruining the original version of the callout effect. Now, the first part of this tutorial is absolutely going to be the most technical, and that is adding in the option of changing the speed of the animation. I'm gonna do my best to break this down. Just stick with me. Trust me, it's worth learning all of these different tidbits of how to animate inside of Apple Motion. The first thing I noticed when I opened up this project, the project is actually not centered up properly. And what I mean by that is that they have a marker here that is actually after the middle of the project. So the project is 2 seconds long and it's showing it at 1:03. So let's go ahead, park our playhead directly in the center and drag that poster frame right to the middle. Then we're gonna take the build in and drag that to the left side and the build out optional to the right side. So now we properly know the center of our project, and this is going to be super helpful when it comes to adding in animations and changing the speed of those animations. Next, we need to adjust the animations that are already in this project and make them a little bit easier to work with when it comes to changing the animation speed. So to do that, come on over to the left side and locate Mix in Backgrounds. From there, we'll click that arrow to expand it, and you should see Rectangle Mix Color to BG and Rectangle Animate Fade of Original. I'm not quite sure what the naming convention behind all of this was, but I do know what layers are adjusting what. Thirdly, we're also going to need to expand out this null keyframes drive animation sync, and you'll see this link parameter in there. The first thing I want to work with is this top rectangle. And when we select that, you should see all the keyframes happening down here at the bottom of our timeline. And to make things a little bit easier to see, I'm actually going to go ahead and just completely disable the main timeline. That way we can see just the animation frames. You should see this animation that's pretty well replicated on both sides. They're slightly different, but not enough to be noticeable. What I want to do to make our lives so much easier when it comes to animation is make sure our playhead is directly in the middle of the project. Then we'll come on over to the left side and add in a keyframe. From there, we're gonna click on this down arrow and go to after last keyframe, select ping pong. So that means that after the last keyframe has happened in the timeline, the animation is going to play in reverse. But you'll notice that we have these other keyframes happening here on the timeline, and I want to clear those out. So just click and drag to create a box selection and press delete. You'll notice now that we're left with this dotted line, which is a replica of this first animation. Whatever changes we make on this left-hand side are going to show up on that right-hand side. And that's going to make it way easier when it comes time to adjust the animation speed of this project. So we're going to actually need to do this on 3 separate layers. This first layer that we've already done it on. Next, this rectangle animate fade of original. So I'm just gonna add in a keyframe here in the direct center, click and drag to delete those 2 keyframes on the right, and we can go ahead and select after last keyframe ping pong here on the left side again. And finally, we can go ahead and select Link Custom Mix Drive Syncs. Now this animation looks a little bit different, but it's the same steps involved. We can go ahead, add a keyframe directly here in the middle, click and drag to select those other keyframes and delete them. And I'm gonna do just a bit of cleanup because there's this random stray keyframe here on the left side. So we'll just delete that. Then from there, we can go ahead and click after last keyframe, ping pong. So now all three of these layers have perfectly looped animations and they will play almost exactly as they did before without any noticeable differences. But what we have done is set ourselves up for success when it comes to changing these animations. It's going to be a way cleaner process than if we were manually animating all of those keyframes at the same time. So how do we make it so a user can change these animation speeds? Well, for this process, we're going to use what's called a pop-up rig inside of Apple Motion. To do so, go ahead and make sure your Link Custom Mix Drive Sync is selected. Go to your inspector and you'll see the custom mix is red, indicating that it's been animated, and that's the value we want to adjust. I'm going to click on this down arrow and then select Add to Rig. We'll go to Rigs Published because this is a rig we want over in Final Cut Pro, and that's just how this file has everything named. And we'll change it to Add to New Pop-Up. You should see your pop-up over here on the left side. You'll see Snapshot 1, and if you click on Snapshot, you'll notice that we have 1, 2, and 3. These are the values that we're going to use to animate everything. If I'm in Snapshot 1, and I make changes to an object that's inside of Snapshot 1, so in this case, these animation keyframes, those changes will be retained whenever I select Snapshot 1. The same thing happens with Snapshot 2. So if I were to make animation changes, you can see now here in Snapshot 2 that it's at 0.8, but then we go back to Snapshot 1 and it's at 1.0. So this is what drives this whole animation speed thing, is we can make changes to the different values we need to, and those will be retained in the different snapshots. So staying in Snapshot 1, let's go ahead and find the other objects we want to animate. So we'll find Rectangle Mix Color to BG, and this one's been animated under Opacity. So we'll go ahead, Add to Rig, Rigs Published, Pop-Up, and finally Rectangle Animate Fade of Original. We'll click that down arrow, Add to Rig, Rigs Published, and select Add to Pop-Up. So selecting that pop-up, we should see all of those different animations here on the left side. Now I want to easily see all of the different layers happening down here in my timeline. So to do that, let's go ahead and select each layer and select Show in Keyframe Editor. And I just did that for all three, and now we can see all of the animations taking place here down in the timeline. Now you may notice that some of these animations are actually doubled up because they're exactly the same. So if I were to go ahead and hold Shift before clicking and dragging, you can see now that these separate out and there's actually 2 keyframes there. So just keep that in mind that when you're animating one keyframe, you might actually be animating 2. So to make these changes, we first need to change what snapshot we're on, because by default, we want these all to take 1 second, which is the default animation speed. So coming on over to the left, we'll see Snapshot 1. Let's rename that to 1 second. Next, we can go ahead and change the snapshot to Snapshot 2, and we'll just rename this to be 0.5 seconds. Taking a look here at our timeline, let's park our playhead at the 30 frame mark. This is a 60 frame timeline, so 30 frames is going to be halfway through. From there, we can go ahead and make a box selection over this keyframe, and click and drag and hold Shift, and that will lock it to that axis. So now we've gotten that to the 30 frame mark. Let's do the same thing with this keyframe, which is on this first build-in animation. So we'll just click and drag and hold Shift to lock it to that axis and get it over to that 30 frame mark. So pushing play, we'll see the animation speed is much faster, and it's duplicated here on the right hand side because of that ping pong animation. Finally, let's change this over to 0.25 seconds. So we'll rename that 0.25 seconds, or whatever you want to name it as. We'll take our playhead to the 15 frame mark, which would be 1/4 of a second, and we'll do the exact same thing. Click and drag and hold Shift, click, drag, hold Shift. So now pushing play, the animation speed is way faster. And you can set this to whatever you like for your own projects, but these are the 3 most broadly used animation speeds. I'm gonna go ahead, set this back to 1 second, and we can see the speed is much slower. So that is looking great, but we need to make sure we have access to this over in Final Cut Pro. So to do that, go ahead and find your pop-up, double click on it, and just rename it to speed. From there, we'll go to the left side, clicking on this down arrow, we'll push publish. So now we'll have complete access to this in Final Cut Pro once we save our project. So that was by far the most technical aspect of this, but the next parts are going to be much easier and they're still going to add a whole lot of features into this particular effect. I want to make it so you can add a gradient to the outline in case that's something you want to do with your branding and colors. So to do that, let's go ahead and select our project, go over to the project tab, and we'll see outline color. I'm going to click that down arrow and then select reveal original parameter, and that will take us to the proper stroke filter which it is using. At the top you'll see stroke type is color. Let's go ahead and click this down arrow and select publish. Then you'll notice that if I change this over to gradient, we suddenly get a gradient line here. If we want to be able to publish this over to Final Cut Pro, you would expect to push this down arrow here on the right, but for some reason that's not available to us. So we actually need to right click directly on the gradient and then select publish, and now that will be available in Final Cut Pro. The next feature I want to add is the ability to hide the on-screen controls in Final Cut Pro, because as it is, the on-screen controls are kind of a mess. There's just a lot going on with slice scale filters and disk warp filters. So let's make it so you can hide those if you ever want to get a full preview of what you're working with. To do that, we're going to locate this controllers OSC group. Go ahead and expand that out, and then expand out this rectangle FSWOSC. And in here, you're gonna see all of the various controls used to drive this particular effect. But what's really cool is we can move the position of this object and all of the on-screen controls will move with it. So for example, let me select the slice scale, and you can see where that is on the screen here on the right. If I go to properties and adjust the position, you'll notice that slice scale is actually moving around. So this is how we're gonna hide it. We're gonna create a checkbox, and when you click that checkbox, it will throw everything way off into the ether. Find your rectangle FSWOSC layer and go to the position parameter. We can click on this down arrow, select add to rig, published, add to new checkbox. Then from there, you'll notice this checkbox at the top. It's currently disabled, which means when it's disabled, we want to hide everything. So we'll just find the X and Y values, and holding shift, just click and drag like crazy. So that goes way off into the X direction. But then when the checkbox is checked, you'll notice that that goes back to 0. This is a great way to hide on-screen controls. Now that we've done that, we can rename this checkbox to be hide OSC or whatever you want to call it. And we can click on this down arrow and select publish. So now that's easily available over in Final Cut Pro. The last visual change I want to add to this is to clean up the UI, because as it is, there are a lot of different elements all within the publish parameters. So what I mean by that is, let's select project, we'll go to the project pane, and you can see all of the various controls we have access to. Firstly, let's go ahead and adjust where this stroke type and gradient filter are. So I'm going to select both of those holding shift and then just simply click and drag that up to above outline offset. Then if I change this back over to color, we should see now the color switches over to this single slider, and I can actually just drag that stroke type above that. Next, I'm going to take my speed slider and drag that all the way to the top, just under the build in, build out animation, because I feel like animation kind of goes together in a category. And finally, we can have hide OSC here at the bottom. Next, I want to add in some dividers. To do so, go on up to add object and select rig. We're going to rename this rig to be spacers, and from there we can go on over to our pop-ups. I'm going to go ahead and add 4 pop-ups for this, 1, 2, 3, 4. Then after that, we're going to need to go in and clear out the name of all of these different snapshots. So coming over to the right, you'll see this minus symbol, and go ahead and just click that twice. That's going to remove 2 snapshots. Then we'll select rename, and we'll push space and enter. So now that is a completely empty field, and this works great for adding in dividers. Let's do the same for the remaining 3. So now I've completely cleared out the name of all these pop-ups, but they still have their given name over here on the right side. So we're going to need to change that as well. Double click, push Command A to select all, then push space and enter, and now it's cleared out. And finally, we need to publish all of these dividers. So we'll go over to the left side, clicking this down arrow and selecting publish. Finally, we can go into our project under the project pane and see all of our dividers here at the bottom. Let's just drag these into position. So firstly, I want to go ahead and separate out the animations. Next, I want to separate the outlines from the backgrounds. Third, I want to separate out the background from the positioning tools. And lastly, I want to separate out the positioning tools from the on-screen controls hider and HDR white level. Okay, we've done an enormous amount with this effect, and it's already raised the level of quality that you can get with this effect. But there's one last thing I want to do, and that is to convert it over to a title. I'm going to go ahead and save it as it is as an effect. So I'll push Command S to save it. Then from there, we can convert it to a title. Let's go on up to the top left under File, then go to Convert Project to, and finally select Title. Go ahead and leave the title source as the effect source. That's just going to leave everything pretty much as it is. Next, you should notice that it's added this type text here layer. Go ahead and just select that and push backspace to delete it. And finally, there's one last super important step if you want to convert this over to a title. Currently, with how it's set up, if we scroll to the bottom, you'll see the source group. And if I expand that, you'll notice the title background. However, the title background is currently inside of a group that's been disabled. It's super important that your title background for this particular reframe effect is in fact enabled. However, if I were to enable the source group, you'll notice that playing through, all of our background blurring and everything is completely removed. So let's fix that. Instead, we'll redisable the source group, and we're just simply going to click and drag our title background up to underneath the clone layer. Now, if it's giving you that weird little shortcut arrow next to the clone layer, just drag it one layer above and then push Command left bracket to drop it in the layer stack. And by doing that, we now have access to all of the blurring and the new animations. Plus, if I push Command S, we can just call this Callout Plus. Throw it into whatever category we like. I created a new category for a reframe so it matches what Final Cut Pro has. You can create new categories here at the bottom. So we'll select reframe and we can push publish. It's going to ask if I want to replace it. That's because I've already created this effect once. But now that we've done that, we can go over into Final Cut Pro. Now, not only are we going to have a callout here on the right side, for me it's callout copy 1, and I can apply that and see all of the various changes we've added, like speed and the ability to hide the on-screen controls. But we can also go to the top left under the reframe category and see Callout Plus. So if I go ahead and delete this effect off, we have access to Callout Plus as a title. Now you might be asking, why is it so much more valuable as a title? Let's say, for example, that this particular layer had a whole bunch of cuts inside of it. If I applied it as an effect, I would need to reapply that same effect and remove the animations and such on it every single cut. But by making it a title, I can lay it over the top of everything and it's still going to retain the callout animation without the various cuts affecting it. This video has been a monster, but hopefully you learned something valuable about Apple Motion inside of it. If you enjoyed this video and you really want to take your Apple Motion knowledge to the next level, then you really got to check out my Apple Motion Masterclass. Over there, I have over 8 hours of training for you. I'm creating more bonus videos all of the time. I have live streams that are exclusive to members only over there. There's an exclusive Discord channel. It's really just an amazing place to take your Apple Motion skills to the next level. So if you're interested in that, there is a link down below. Plus, if you're a Patreon member, you can get 30% off of the course using your special Patreon member discount. Don't forget, you can download these finished project files completely for free over on my Patreon and level up your Final Cut Pro editing, even if you're not in Final Cut Pro 11. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this super long video, and I cannot wait to see you in the next one.